Hello everyone, today we talk about the reign of Henry V the Salian, 1105-6 essentially, 1125. It's not the first time that we talk about his reign. At least I made a video about the Sutri agreement in 1111 that somehow introduces this topic inasmuch as, of course, the investiture controversy is concerned. That video, albeit was not an old one, but it was published when the channel wasn't rolling adequately, and every time I talk about Christian history, people for some reason watch like half of the other compared to the normal, let's say, traffic. In any case, it's a very important video because the Sutri agreement, within essentially the context we will be seeing today of heavy, relentless, intensive negotiation between the emperor and the papacy, had fundamentally the almost utopistic statement laid out that finally, the emperor should have cared only about temporal matters and the pope spiritual ones. It was just a declaration, as we will understand even better now. This was not really feasible in any way, but the sort of political, diplomatic needs of compromise, today we will see it mostly from the emperor's side, There's also the papal one, but we will talk about, this is a video on Germany and or the empire, at least as a whole, was one of turmoil, was one of heavy, let's say, destabilization of the German monarchy. I made a video also about Christian history that is titled, if I'm not wrong, the privatization of episcopal, or the feudalization, of episcopal investitures, in post Concordat of Worms, Germany. That the Concordat of Worms in 1122 was, and we will see it today, fundamentally the peace between the papacy and the empire that would put an end at least to the canonic phase of what we call the investiture controversy. Of course, this continued over time, and it was always sort of impending, because of the intrinsic nature of the various of the two universal powers, that however never disconfessed each other as such, because actually they had a lot really deriving from each other's existence in many ways. And again, we will go back perhaps in some other video to the root of that, because I think it's a hell of a topic, or at least the most interested followers are, generally speaking, saying, yes, we want to hear more about those. Not many, but it's also a topic without which you cannot fully understand medieval history, or even ancient history to some degree, and as a whole, And the Concordat of Worms had settled finally this matter on a national basis. That is to say, the Pope would maintain the essentially the investiture of the Italian bishops, whereas the emperor, the one of Germany, this was naturally not going fully respected on both sides. There were also other cases like, what about Burgundy? And of course there were some specific practical reasons for which the same bishops actually needed the both of them. There was actually a preeminence, a prelection. That is to say, in Italy, first the Pope had to accept the election, but also of course the emperor could confirm it. And so these things were at times episodic, intermittent, because of course there were imperial and papal legates pretty much everywhere, but they had also to go on ad hoc missions in order to recognize such investitures. So we will see this likely and better in another video. But the figure of Henry V in himself is quite fascinating, because as you know, he succeeded his father, Henry IV the Salian, that had basically had the toughest time of the investiture controversy. He is one of the so-called humiliation of Canossa, the one that had to start this fundamentally civil war, because at his excommunication, lots of German, not just princes, but also clergymen, rebelled against him. This is also essentially the time of the rise, and we were talking about it just the other day in the video about medieval Swabia, of the Hohenstaufen that fundamentally received the, they married into the Salians, right? Henry's sister Agnes was married to the Hohenstaufen, and that's also where they descend from, because they had been the only ones who had stuck to Henry IV in the moment of greatest sort of collapse of the picture, and much of the subsequent, say, in the following generations, German coming back in Italy is fueled by this sort of course, revanchism and hatred that had been matured regarding what was happening south of the Alps, that had fundamentally destructured a consistent amount of the German national monarchy, right? And there is a very interesting historiographic debate on this, had fundamentally brought astray, in fact, the process of power concentration, because some historians say, well, basically Germany, up to this point, or right around it, was just endowed with the same sort of monarchic national potential of England or France. I think it's slightly, of course it is different. I mean, there are different countries, different degrees, but I would say that there were some characters, say, already political, institutional dynamics, not just those, by the way, in Germany, that would make things go towards another direction. There is no doubt that a part of the country had a great potential, and definitely in the second half of the 12th century, say, the Germanic Empire, we can call it this way, was fundamentally the strongest power in Europe. But at the same time, with those limitations that on the longer run would still be the basis on which the national monarchy would fall apart. And so, first of all, the sort of elective system that was much more pronounced than even in theory, it's a matter of succession, but it's also a matter of actual nobiliary recognition, right? Also, France and England had their time of, say, yes, kings succeed because we elect them. That was historically the Germanic thing, but even the Roman thing, tried. But of course, when you have a monarchic structure that eventually wants to build a feudal state, like in this cases, the mechanism must, say, be distinguished thoroughly from country to country, and again, part of what we will see here and through the videos that we have already made on similar topics really can explain. When Henry IV had died, of course, much of the papal opposition to the imperial cause had a sort of slowing down. At least, of course, now the games were open in Germany to see what would happen, who would be elected, right? It was true also for the Germans themselves, because as we'll see now, it wasn't much about the investiture issue in itself. It was about what kind of king, right, is posturing himself within the same German, right, not just towards the papacy, about which, let's say, this was the mechanism normally. The German princes were, like basically in other countries, always opposed to or at least, of course, negotiating in a confrontational way with the monarchy, as long as they weren't the monarchic houses themselves, right? So it was about, again, let's negotiate, let's elect the next one. And in the case of the Salians, there was a continuity, because this had been an important dynasty. It descended also from the Ottonians. It took the name from, in fact, Franconia, that had in itself bore in itself the legacy of the Frankish imperial grandeur, and also was I made a video about medieval Franconia. I would say it was one of the most prosperous parts of Germany at the time. So in August 1106, you have another significant death, that is the one of the Duke of Saxony Magnus. without any male heir that could have basically stood for at least an undisputed succession. At that point, you would expect this creating a lot of problems for Henry, because as the say next German ruler, he had to appoint the next Duke of Saxony. In those circumstances, that's when Lothar of Supplenburg, right, that would have eventually succeeded him to the German throne, was appointed, in fact, by Henry. And the interesting aspect about this is that there were technically some competitors specific for the ducal throne of Saxony, and specifically the husbands of both of Magnus' daughters, right, that would in fact later claim the duchy. I made a video about the Duchy of Saxony in general. We do not delve into excessive detail when we look at those sort of comprehensive histories of several centuries of these regions. But as we've seen, it was never quite just, especially at this point before the rise of Henry the Lion, etc., quite the same power, the same unified power that, or at least the concentrated one that could oppose the same Swabians at some point. But in any case, the new King Henry was equally successful in other contentious parts of the realm. For example, the Duchy of Lorraine, being more decentralized in the west, had always, and having lacked sort of a strong man in power due to the feudal fragmentation of the land, would in fact be contended between these various pretendants. That's when Henry had a revelation, because the same opponents of Henry IV on the ecclesiastical issues of the investiture, and that had specifically clergymen who had basically not in fact accepted, they had supported the Pope and not accepted Henry IV's authority in their own investiture, did receive it from Henry V, right? There are different reasons for this. First of all, it wasn't that simple for anyone at the time. Doesn't matter how strong the need for sort of decentralization in the face of this sort of stronger German monarchies, the judicial and religious issues inherent the new course had, of course, highlighted a lot of practical issues, right? They had essentially left a gray area that at some point could create more instability than stability. So the investiture controversy had ended up being just a form of protest against that king that would have not respected particular issues, even if they were not really connected with investiture at all, right? Because even though, as we said before, after the Concordat of Worms, the German episcopate was sort of privatizing, feudalizing, and sort of receiving investiture basically in the same feudal lay fashion, and with interesting, again, institutional consequences for the country, they still were right on that track and were heavily invested in this sort of realpolitik, right, of different beneficia. We will see now how the regalia and the temporalia thing goes, right, because there was simply something what was given by the king that the king could still somehow have a control on, whereas the temporalia were basically any sort of temporal good that had been obtained in a way or another by the clergy, as not spiritualia, were thought to be in fact to be handled. This is what the emperors wished by the latter. In fact, this is what at the end of the day was impracticable, because the empire had never really had the capacity of controlling, in fact, even the majority of the same, say, German kingdom, just aside from the support that could be received in order to reactivate the properly imperial policy in the Mediterranean and over, say, gradually Bohemia before Burgundy, etc. But let's say everything was negotiated at that point, and now it seemed that since Henry V had been elected with some sort of, say, milder papal attitude towards him, so that it could be hoped for him to be a milder ruler regarding the previous issue. But it wasn't that simple, for the actually simple fact in turn that the only way for the German monarchy to survive in that situation was to keep on affirming its own imperial prerogatives, at least to the extent that could still be fairly positive, not just in Germany, but in Italy, etc. Right? So it was impossible practically to distinguish the two things that were also so theologically tricky, right? Because it wasn't enough to, say, separate, again, temporal and spiritual. Ideally, that was reached in Sutri eventually, but it was just like a utopia, right? The question was, what do we do with that, let's say, and how do we keep defining from a lay and ecclesiastical perspective all the juridical prerogatives, right? This was a time of, say, properly the investiture controversy proper is one of the single most overlooked chapters in the founding of the success of Western civilization, in my opinion, because it was a great negotiation which sparked an enormous series, especially of legal production, but also just institutional culture, political compaction, because Germany did manage, after all, in the following generation to sort of salvage itself and even push again for the actually highest level of imperial authority de facto accomplished during the Middle Ages in practice. And the same, this is also particularly important, the same German princes, lay or ecclesiastical alike, of course, wanted their own country to be effectively governed, right, by a fair ruler, right, not necessarily a strong one from their own perspective, let's say strong enough to make their own interests without asking for too much, right, in return, right. So it was a very confused picture, to say the least, because there had been open warfare, you see, and the country was in turmoil, to say the least. In 1110, Henry V was able to obtain the hand of Matilda, the famous daughter to the English King Henry I. She would eventually live on as Empress Maud in English history when she came back to her native land, in fact, after Henry's death, childless death, by the way, in 1025. This was an incredibly profitable marriage politically for Henry, as basically, as you know, we made a video about about Anglo-Norman England. We know of the white ship wreck, let's say, that killed the only legitimate son of the King Henry I, and basically triggered one of the most, violent periods of political engulfment and warfare in England, after which the so-called Plantagenets would have emerged. So this, for Henry V, meant to consolidate, importantly, position abroad, and even hoping, right, to even succeed to the English throne because of the aforementioned loss of the only male heir of Henry I, without mentioning that Matilda had brought a rich dowry to Henry, and so this was definitely a plus for making more German princes sticking to him, because they knew how, say, where they could receive compensation from. Henry V was de facto obliged to open the negotiations regarding the investiture controversy basically as soon as his father died, right? Given that, again, this was not a negligible topic whatsoever. He was to become King of Italy, and as such, later on, also Emperor, and he, of course, had to maintain some sort of caution for this very reason with Pope Pascal II, that had been, great opponent of the same Henry IV. And so just think about the nuisance of just even of these rulers in the first place in this situation, whichever their feelings towards their father, the other figures, having this duty and not really, being able to escape that, and knowing at the same time perfectly well why you have to pursue that. In fact, only an agreement with the papacy could quell the rebellion, you can say, of the German clergy, right? At least to the degree that this had thrown Germany into turmoil, militarily speaking. So there were some delegations. One met at Guastalla in Lombardy in October 1106. Another one at Chalons-sur-Marne. So we are in the Western Frankish Kingdom in 1107. And in the same Rome in 1109. So this, as we will understand better, had a lot to do with the international situation as well, given that, by the way, what was happening in the empire, in Germany, in Italy, etc., could be essentially adopted eventually as a resolution by the various monarchs in in France, in England. And so consider at this time was not even a fully, let's say, institutionalized sense of the boundaries of the Holy Roman Empire, at least de facto it's what the ones would have remained later on, but it was not practically even established that the emperor couldn't quite simply think to be ruling over France, right, or England. Pretty specific reasons for some of these. For example, England later on would recognize this sort of I made a video on this, and I remember, I think it's Holy Roman Empire, ideology, etc. in the 12th century that analyzes this, how, as it often happens, right, with more decentralized countries actually are more eager to recognize the more distant countries in the first place that risk less in terms of conquest, concentration. In that case, imperial authority, right? What could do the Germans invade England, right? Of course, it wasn't quite possible, but if this imperial recognition over England was used to reinforce the alliance between the two, say between England and Germany against France, for example, well, this would do, right, to some degree. But the issue, again, was particularly thorny for the papacy and the empire. And even though both sides were surely seeking to find an agreement, right, they would factually fail to reach one, at least one that would eventually be applicable for the entire empire, right, and also after quite some time. The regalia were an important object of content, right? So the regalia were the royal prerogatives to make, the long story short, the rights of the kingdom, and so what factually the monarch could was owed, right, within the system. And definitely during the engulfment of Germany into civil war, that is what had immediately come under attack, because that's the thing. It would repeat itself as long as the emperor was excommunicated and or the electors failed to reach an agreement. the country was de facto leaderless, right? And at this point, again, the Ottonian, the Franconian legacy was such that the idea, of course, was to maintain some sort of unity and broader recognition, but with the further feudalization of the country, also enhanced by this de facto imperial failure, was making these rulers operating, at least in more practical terms, right, more distant from the ideal. Both the papacy and the empire recognized in these negotiations that the regalia and the spiritualia were two separated things, right? The main problem, though, was to distinguish. So it's, again, the king does something, and then the church occupies herself of the spiritual matters. But you have to rule on this earth. So the main problem was, again, not much the one between the regalia and the spiritualia, but between the regalia and the temporalia. Because the church, of course, starting from the patrimonium sancti petri and any other possession that the various churches could receive from this or that nobleman, etc., were temporal goods that would be administrated, in fact, as if the clergy had been just a layman of some sort. Depending, of course, on the contract, on some of these temporalia could be just given to the church per se, and this is what also mostly the papacy was trying to say, and any other who received them to see recognized. But traditionally, the empire had to be able to rule still on earth, and so what was the limit there between any practical, even material possession and what the church had? Because the church does not belong to any earthly domain, right? The papal states have never been part of the empire, technically, right? Even though they were de facto within it. But just like the other ecclesiastical possessions, the issue was that the church had at least gained from the end of the Roman Empire so much prerogatives and immunities from the same emperors that it's as if you had, and we can easily see through a map of the time, even though it's difficult to fully render the complication of it, because all these things, say these fiefs, these possessions, superimposed, right? It could be just some, infrastructure or say income rather than an actual property, etc. But it's as if and this is particularly evident in the Holy Roman Empire that remained significantly fragmented. Lots of ecclesiastically dominated areas that the ecclesiastical principalities would remain, right, eventually until the secularization, right, in the 19th century. This is true to some degree also for the other countries, but at least you have in Germany, in Italy, important principalities. We often see ecclesiastical principalities. We always seen them having also very important story in the way they had come to be in order to make the empire actually more functional, right? Especially in the Ottonian era, where actually the emperors did elect the bishops, and that's why the Gregorian reforms had kicked in and the investiture struggle arose, because at that point the papacy had enough leverage to make such temporal power fail. So the temporalia of the within the same, say, sphere of the church. So Henry seems to pose himself as a sort of a lord of proprietary churches, right? The idea was that if a church is being founded by by a layman, this is not quite something that pertains to the patrimonium or to a bishop, right? So everything his churches possessed was to be deemed at the end his, right? Given that the same concept of bishop here, as long as we'll see now, the bishop was appointed, invested, in fact that's what the controversy was about, would be his bishop in that regard, right? So you see how actually the concept of feudalization of the same diocese in a way was out there. It was actually a higher concept, right? The feudalization has to do mostly with the contractual form in which this was provided, but it's as if the emperor had thought that that specific church was sort of his, right? Because he had placed his guy on. The papacy naturally thought something different, right? They distinguished mostly the provenance from the function as far as the temporalia were concerned. That is to say, everything that the churches had materially acquired through, for example, the aforementioned donations, pious works, gifts, etc., by so many donors, including the kings, had been given as such just as inalienable goods because they had entered in the hands again of the church. And so even if the church could and would ask the emperor to defend the same church and all these goods, these were still considered to be part of St. Peter's patrimony, at least of Christ himself, and thus they could not be alienated in any way. Consider that in a country like Germany, this concept was even more relevant because there were literal islands of Allodea that, as you know, would grow to be particularly powerful, with the various princes like claiming some sort of untouchable status within their core possession. So this is a substantial disintegration of the sort of public demand authority and handling of lay and ecclesiastical matters that had existed, at least in the original essence of Romano-Germanic law, right? At least as far as the state had existed. And of course in Germany this was something extremely recent, if it existed at all. And so it was culturally difficult to make, of course, this country first of all come together, but also the Germans to simply accept that a possession was more like the one of an institution than one of freemen, even though these freemen were mostly just the noblemen in charge, while they had been taking over as sort of princely power itself many prerogatives of the local communities. So it's complicated, to say the least. So in other words, these specific temporalia could not be understood as objects of royal transference, right? Just the regalia were certain specific, let's say, I don't know, I owe you the fulcrum, I owe you all, what was also naturally based for imperial reasons on the military needs, right, of Christendom as a whole. There would be some contrast with this because there were, of course, armed partisans of the church, and again, the same civil war in Germany had been quite eloquent about that. But as long as it was about, this guy, this ruler is excommunicated, right, we can't do it, so technically we're not fighting as if the papacy had stolen such imperial prerogative, such regalia, but because we want to have somebody fit in office that can use this power for the right reason. This was just a dialectical thing, right? Eventually, most of these issues were settled on the battlefield. In any case, the papacy distinguished rights and revenues of the temporalia, which the king could possess in that degree, perhaps as royal prerogative, in his capacity of governmental head of the kingdom. Say, you need some part of those, right, but you do not have like a sort of a tribute, but you do not dispose of them, just per se. So it's just like the other temporalia that the ruler actually possessed as regalia, in fact, the for the governmental control of the kingdom. Judicial rights. Remember that the church couldn't quite sentence somebody to death, needed at best, I'd say at least a lay advocate, right? Levying taxes, the right to mint coins, to hold markets, to build fortifications. These were all important rights that, after all, the emperor did have, right? So when you look at, of course, the controversy was pretty messed up in many ways, and you have, say, now we can't simply digress on it for the practical sake of explaining what it was fought like, right? Also, from a military point of view, there were lots of lay powers that were fundamentally rebelling to the emperor as well. Exactly because the Pope had excommunicated that single guy, right? Not the office as such. But the idea is that a functional imperial rule was, of course, needed. Of course, the emperor would say here that the Pope, over the centuries, there would be extreme sort of ideological stance, but in practice, and especially in these centuries, the imperial role was quite felt and understood from the Frankish Teutonian origins of the system, etc. The need of a universal lay temporal authority was, of course, everybody's concern, right? Even those who did not believe in what we just conceive erroneously, in a merely territorial point of view, what we call the Holy Roman Empire, right? And of course, all these royal prerogatives were considered as well as just an unalienable part of the reigning powers of the kings. So after all, it was a compromise of some sort, but the extent to which this could happen was so big, right, that even minimal implications could shift the balance of power, say, in Germany. For example, where ecclesiastical and lay princes had usurped the regalia, well, these guys had to be fought against. And if the king wanted to simply grant part of these prerogatives, he could do through an enfeoffment fundament. So everything was already clearly outlined overall. The Pope was more or less willing to concede that these could be, for example, the objects of a secular investiture in connection with a bishop's assumption to office, right? Whereas others in the papal curia felt that even this was going too far, right? So, of course, a bishop could be invested by the emperor as far as these other public, essentially, functions were concerned. Even though, remember, very much the private nature of public culture north of the Alps. And somebody in the papal curia didn't want that even, because that would have been investing a bishop, say, of a very powerful prerogative that could be, say, moving this bishop astray from the mere diocesan, say, dimension, and so de facto being co-opted by the emperor in another way. And this mechanism is quite relevant. We have some description of the Chalons negotiations, given that the famous Abbot Suger of Saint-Denis, in many ways the father of the first true Gothic cathedral, and in that sense of almost imperial grandeur that the same French monarchy was inspiring to some degree, also because of the Frankish legacy, etc. Tell us, right? He was essentially, as you know, also the Western Frankish king's most influential advisor, and Saint-Denis is the heart and blood of France, right? There is no France outside of Saint-Denis. The Oriflamme, in fact, the very same universal ideology, right, of Dionysus, even, say, the improper historical philological beliefs regarding who was the author of the Areopagite, who was the Areopagite, and they confuse the same with the saint, etc. But this is not so important now. The point being that we're talking about some of the highest nobility in Europe, right, or at least the highest ecclesiastical authorities there that were founding a sort of view of kingship on its own, because let's remember that the imperium and the regnum were starting to sort of acquire new meanings, given this sort of in perspective nationalization of imperial authority on a German basis and the rise of these other powerful national monarchies, such as the one in France, right? And the Abbot Suger is actually very critical of the imperial delegation. He basically depicts them as a band of ruffians that were actually more interested in brutal force, right, imposing their viewpoint on the tip of the swords, and not really being interested in sort of a more edifying debate, right, possibly founded, of course, on a theological principle, but those guys were bringing a theological principle, right, in their own regard. It would be very interesting to digress now on how Germans saw knighthood at the time compared to other countries in Europe, and what was actually that Germany embodied in that imperial dimension, also as far as their, say conflict / cooperation with the church to some extent. We will see it in some other video. However, in Suger's report, chronologically, we can't find what Henry actually agreed to, what he actually did in Italy 2 years later, right, to receive his imperial crown that, as we will see, was obtained against some specific promises to the papacy that could not be maintained, even in front of the German princes. What happened in Chalons is a bit of a mystery, because it's unlikely that the German delegation was just that bad as it sounds. In any case, the following events right in Italy really show what the German king was willing to do in order to maintain his power, right? Which also raises some questions regarding what he was really expecting to obtain in practice, right? First of all, he concluded a secret treaty with the Pope in the Roman Church of Santa Maria in Turri, which again was kept secret front of the German, especially German ecclesiastical princes. Substantially, Henry promised the Pope to abstain from investitures on the condition that the bishops would abandon the regalia, which he now conceded not did encompass pious donations. In other words, the emperor was surrendering entirely the program that he had, say, his predecessors had maintained, right, in the previous generations, in exchange for the bishops to basically give away all the regalia that had not been, let's say, conceded just formally, but that had been acquired in a way or another, and that had been considered at some point by the church as some pious donation. This was obviously unacceptable, because it was just, again, saying that the emperor could have not had at that point any capacity of investing the bishops, even in Germany. And this is not what he wanted either, but he needed the imperial crown, right? And on the occasion of the crowning ceremony, this secret treaty was actually made known within properly the Lateran Church itself. And so at that point, not just the ecclesiastical, but also the lay princes of Germany rose in tumult, right? This was known, of course, in north of the Alps, and one again wonders again what is that Henry was hoping to achieve now, because of course it was a gamble, right? And it was just a desperate move, right? But what could be accomplished eventually, right? Yes, he having the crown, but then when the ruler, so in fact the opposition to his promise, that remember was done with the support of God, let's say the imperium, this was the guy who had to carry the world empire, right, had made this treaty that thus just entailed either, that he was surrendering all of what the empire had been just wanted, right, even for itself, even those who didn't want to be appointed by the emperor, but there were many that instead wanted that actually. And on the other hand, if he wanted to keep on, say, ruling, he had to evidently come less to his word, right? This treaty was just to be broken, and so where would have been the imperial trust there, right? So Henry turned on the other end, right? When he saw that his magnates in Germany were so upset by this, he claimed at that point again the investiture with ring and staff as regalia, so has his public prerogative even, which meant to overturn completely the secret theory of Santa Maria in Turin. And of course the Pope refused to concede any of this. At that point Henry used force, took him prisoner, and essentially extorted from the papacy the privilege, the so-called Ponte Mammolo privilege, right? This essentially granted de facto the investiture with ring and staff back to the emperor as an ancient custom of the empire, right? Let's stress again that eventually it was not about canceling the investiture, right? It was just a matter of preeminence. Who had the truer, let's say, ecclesiastical, episcopal investiture, and who had just to agree what the other universals already had decided, right? That's how, in fact, they came to Worms, because there was a neatly separated German and Italian, say, sphere of influence. So this was just a sort of shock reveal moment, because it was abundantly clear there, even in front of the kingdoms of France and England, what the German ruler's ultimate point really was. Henry justified himself by saying that through this reacquisition of this ancient prerogative, he meant really just to transfer the temporalia and was not to influence on the spiritualia. But again, in practice, what did that mean? It was just like coming back before the Gregorian reforms, ideally, and that was not even possible. In fact, this move made it even worse. There was a Lateran synod in 1112 that essentially revoked the Ponte Mammolo privilege, which was defined as privilege, so essentially illegal, and of course it also excommunicated Henry, which was kind of the least after what had happened. So this relaunched the feud, because Henry had obtained the Roman imperial crown, which was a huge deal anyway, but he got excommunicated at the same time, right? And so basically at this point you have the same pattern within the empire that had been existing at the time of Henry IV, Henry's father. Problems erupted once again in Saxony, that, as we've seen, even though it was not particularly compact, as the events would prove, was, generally speaking, say, not particularly happy of Franconian interference. In fact, Henry's power base was mostly founded in the Rhine, the Main, etc. And the Saxons were particularly unhappy of the way Henry handled the inheritance of the Count Ulrich II of Weimar-Orlamünde, who had died without issue in 1112. And this essentially spread from Saxony and beyond, right? And Lothar of Supplenburg was leading such revolt against Henry V. Henry was defeated in battle in 1114 and 1115, plus a major ecclesiastical ruler, the Archbishop Adalbert of Mainz, sent reinforcements to the rebels. Adalbert had specific reasons to be opposed to Henry's policy, not just because he was at the head of the largest and most renowned archbishopric in the Eastern Frankish kingdom, thus unavoidably, by the way, assuming the position of spokesman for the ecclesiastical opposition, but because, as a member of the House of the Counts of Saarbrücken, his clan had been significantly damaged territorially by Henry, and this was fueling sort of the secular grounds on which to be resentful, aside from his, again, prelate position, right? It's important to stress that traditionally the German church had been loyal to the monarchy, but in general, like, these are events that prove how, of course, how divisive really the investiture controversy really was, and so how say consistent the premises already for the further privatization of the system, right, that really were even before Worms. As it often happens in the moment of greatest say conflict, right, and in this case, despite the papal excommunication, the fact that Henry resorted to yet another anti-pope, this is what emperors did at some point, so it's violent mess, right? But negotiations over the investiture controversy never really fully stopped, even in, again, most intense moments. There was, again, war raging in Germany, in Italy. Everything was, again, we will see it in depth for the various countries in other videos. But the German establishment in 1121 asked, because of the strains that the country had been suffering, a reconciliation between the Pope and the Emperor. As often happens also at some point, when two sides are exhausted, right, they cut it, they cut a deal. And in this circumstance, you have the Concordat of Worms, as such, Concordat. Papal legates went to Germany, which was concretized in this most famous, in fact, cornerstone in medieval European history. I don't know how many people today that call themselves, like, medieval history enthusiasts actually understand the relevance of 1122. Right, we will see it also in some greater depth. Essentially, both sides provided with a list of promises which were accepted, right, through the double thread of a papal and royal privilege, right, and as such were exchanged on this fatidic September the 23rd, 1122. This happened at the Wiese, just outside the gate of Worms. And how did things work? Well, we referred to that before. But regarding the temporalia and the regalia, right, Henry fundamentally promised that he was renouncing all investitures with ring and staff, because aside from the sort of Italian-German different ratio in order, etc., that would affirm itself over time, the papacy accepted the idea that the bishop-elect could receive the regalia at the hands of the emperor, right, and through the symbol of a scepter, by the way, so not the pastoral and the ring, right, so to specify that that was not a prerogative that the emperor had, just like the older episcopal one, but the one of appointing bishops just by himself as his man, but something that proceeded, of course, in parallel with the investiture. All right, this was the papal investiture from a public sort of secular point of view, right? And in 1123, a treaty declaring the investiture contest to have fundamentally ended, even though we wouldn't quite simply like that, was approved in the Lateran Council. Now again, the thing is more complex than explain it now, but we will make a video in which we will observe how this worked practically, and also in the various kingdoms of the empire. But it seems, right, that politically this was the best solution. In fact, the one they finally found, once it was realized that the agreement was followed, right, in different ways in Germany and in Italy, simply because the German episcopal churches wouldn't quite simply follow that, even though they were deeply influenced by it. And again, I made that video to explain how all these years of civil war had undermined the same imperial authority and the state, public in general. So they would adapt to that, but the emperor would maintain a preeminence in Germany, right? He would appoint the bishops first, right, and then the Pope would, if anything, confirm. And the other way around was in Italy, and there were other different. Again, this depended on the single bishops, because as you understood during the controversy, the various wars that followed, there were many sides changing, and depending also on what, as we've seen, the Saint Henry was doing first, promising everything to the Pope, then going completely against that. So also being a bishop in this circumstance wasn't easy at all. In all this, in a moment in which evidently there wasn't much room, especially with civil war in Germany, for an imperial policy in the Mediterranean. Yes, Henry arrived. There was in Italy, there was in fact warfare there too. We've seen the violence exercised on the same Pope, but at the end of the day, the Concordat of Worms was a watershed in the history of the Eastern Frankish Kingdom, and it would have this, say, softly undermining capacity that, however, sort of increased in effect whenever, in fact, the emperors kept not succeeding what they wanted. Later on, the Hohenstaufen realized that the best choice was to try to centralize again from Italy, to impose the Pope, the older sort of order regarding, say, it had existed in Anatolian times. So the Germans were quite shattered by these events. The face of the country somehow changed. The great effort from Otto I, his father, to bring things together, right? and to surpass the sort of ethnic ducal elective system, etc., was never quite surpassed. This was a moment that really tilted the balance in favor of the princes as opposed to public authority that suffered instead enormously of that. Again, it's a big topic because it's intertwined also with the actual territorial history that we have been seeing, we will keep observing. I really have a lot in store as far as this period in German history is concerned. We're covering really, and finally, lots of interesting corners of various medieval history book pages, let's say, but everything has still to take form at the same time. What is striking is that, again, the German bishops didn't even have, most of the times, a text of the Concordat of Worms. It was never referred to in particular cases, when also later authors mention the event. They realized that they indirectly admitted to have little awareness of it in the first place. And this is another aspect, again, the fact that even though, of course, the Holy Roman Empire had reconnected latitudinally, also Germany, Italy, and so on, these were fundamentally different countries, right? They were two different areas. They worked in concretely different ways, politically and institutionally, and so this, say, struggle had really taken up sort of the meaning of the contraposition of two different worlds, to some degree, that were still deeply intertwined, don't get me wrong. We have seen it often, especially with northern Italy, and then again, just a generation from this, you have Barbarossa, the Lombard League, but it's exactly the same point. I mean, there is a history of the German kingdom that goes in parallel with the Mediterranean policy of the empire that is trying to affirm a broader power, essentially on the traditional basis of the fact that there had to be an emperor, but the capacity of this emperor to finally, even with an enormous power, like again the strongest power in Europe in the second half of the 12th century, to be fully recognized as such, right? This epopee eventually reaches its peak in the 13th century, but a bit all this world lived eventually in the wake of this memory of this legion, of this grand tale that, as we've seen, lived eventually within the veins of specific German lands. Again, we made a video about Swabia recently, but I think that understanding the deeper roots behind this, and especially in the practice of what, in fact, the empire had meant since the beginning, and also in this functionality, there is no doubt about this, right? At least in the Renovatio Imperii. Well, you can see an effort, you can see a civil but also a military dimension being busted forward, right? In relation to tradition, in relation to the Roman past, in relation with this, again, need of salvation through the same universal fulfillment of holy war duties, and then and victory herself, right? The Concordat of Worms was rather seen as a peace treaty between the Pope and the Emperor, right? That's what it got down to. As we've seen, the German magnates were tired, the Pope sent his legates, and the thing went on with this settlement, right? There is an interesting spark of, say, written culture spreading at this point. Again, early 12th century Germany was still a substantially, say, archaic country, we can say. We see, of course, however, a need for the same emperors to found their rights on a much sounder basis, Roman law was being essentially reconstructed in Italy later on, Barbarossa would exploit this to back imperial prerogatives, because, as you know, Roman law, just like in the Byzantine world, considered the state, the empire, superior, say, at least to rule on the church to much greater extent than it was in, say, at this point in Latin Germanic Europe. And there was a bitter realization that large parts of the German kingdom had been disrupted by these ferocious wars, right? And so that if you had to refound the country from these ashes, you needed a regulation. You needed to make settlements, to make peace, right? And so customs began to to take more shape, right? Especially in a feudal guise, because that's what, as we've seen, was the main way, not just by French influence, but just by the further reduction of public authority. That paradoxically, however, brought to that sort of better definition, right, of who were the Reichsfürsten, right? The fact that the regalia could be accepted through a scepter, right, in the investiture of archbishops, bishops, and abbots, well, brought these guys through such symbol of rulership as, you know, to the full level of the princes of the realm. This is what we were saying for the major watershed, right? The feudalization of the episcopal investiture in Germany, and so the fact of the rise of the German bishops to a much greater level of seigneurial power than the one that still was enjoyed significantly in England, France, Italy, etc. This would be normal, right? But generally speaking, the German bishops, this would be evident a century after. We've seen it also in the videos about Richard of Cornwall, the interregnum. There the situation has really further changed, right? But the even the warlikeness of the German bishops, not because they were necessarily more or less warlike. Yes, Germany had a significant degree of militarization, because it didn't really have a frontier, and still this internal situation was sort of turbulent normally. But because they had truly vast power, just as other, other princes, in the absence really of other, say, of a state, right? And it is at this point that you see, it was true before to a large extent throughout most of Eastern Frankish history, and not only, right? This is true more or less in all the kingdoms, or actually all of them. But the bishops here make up, in fact, for the existence of a state and support the emperor, because from the lay princes that have greater prerogatives, they are actually more, of course, warlike, militarized, and they just have greater right of capital punishment, etc., so higher justice, that they can only dispense within the same ecclesiastical principalities, right? But the fact of what you have, also because there are many bishops in Germany, not just the bigger ones that would become electorates, etc., but you have bishops becoming the same level of dukes, right? We've seen this easily in the feuds of episcopal nature. We've seen it in the series about the ministeriales, right, etc. So the regalia granted by the papacy, the Concordat, allowed these guys to wield de facto power on behalf of the emperor within their own territories, as if they had been any other lay, say, vassals who were provided with subjects, rather, but provided with this public, in fact, prerogatives, right? Problems were not over. There was another confrontation in 1123 between the emperor and Lothar of Supplenburg regarding the appointment of a margrave, right, in which the Saxons prevailed over Henry, right? We do not actually know what the Concordat would have brought to Henry's rule if he had not died, childless, by the way, in May 1125, right? Things could have kept messed up, as it's likely. Otherwise, there could have been some sort of pacification. In any case, the German princes, led by Archbishop Adalbert, so the opposite faction to Henry, called to Mainz for the royal election, chose Lothar, same Lothar Supplenberg, the Duke of Saxony, so Henry's greatest enemy, to succeed him, right? And this is something, again, we've seen in the video about the Duchy of Saxony, and we will keep looking at that phase because it's, again, this intricated to some extent, but it tells you how literally the German monarchy came to be shaped the way it did, right? So it's not, it's step by step, land by land, with substantial shifts, like in the areas of power and competition, and so on. Needless to say, after Lothar, we have essentially the rise of the Hohenstaufen, and this would lead to, in fact, that also sort of polarization of Germany. It's wrong to talk about blocks in general in history, but as you know, that was the thing: Franconian Swabia versus Saxony and Bavaria in a way, but even more nuanced than this, right? And that did help at some point. Like, that's the second half of the 12th century also. The closest that the German monarchy went to the national accomplishment, right? But the Swabians prefer still the imperial, let's say the Mediterranean adventure, because of course it was more remunerative. If it hadn't been for the resistance, of course, it was to be met there as well. But this is something I already discussed in other videos, and we will see better also in others, hopefully. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.